In this lecture, we are going to cover the role of invasive pests or species in the restoration process. The primary goal of what I want to cover here in this lecture really deals with an introduction to invasive pests, what they do to the environments that we wish to restore, and then a basic process or principles that we can use to help manage these invasive species as part of our overall restoration plan. So regardless of where you work on your ecosystem restoration project, invasive species or pest species are going to pose a major challenge to how you implement your restoration and will oftentimes dictate how well you succeed at that restoration project. These invasive species create the greatest ongoing need for labor, money, and planting once your restoration plan is completed. And the practice of restoration is often seriously confounded and complicated by the presence of these invasive species, in part because they constrain site preparation and restoration implementation. They'll outcompete the desired species that you hope to foster with your restoration plan. They'll degrade wildlife habitat and alter ecosystem structure and function. So let's look at some of the characteristics of invasive species before we get too far into this material. So pests or pest species, which we'll refer to here as invasive species, are also you'll also see called alien species or exotic invaders. And so for the purpose of this lecture and for our restoration class, we're going to define invasive species as those species, native or non-native, that include plants and animals that interfere with restoration goals and objectives. Right? And so it's important to understand that this is a situational or operational definition, in that the species behaves as a pest may, under different circumstances and at different times, or in the same or different place, be a beneficial component of the ecosystem being restored. So we need to think about this from where we're coming from and how that species is interacting specifically with our restoration plan. And so an example of a native species that in western parts of the United States, or even in the northern lake states, that can be detrimental to some of your restoration plans, but is a native species, is trembling aspen, so Populus tremuloides. And so this is a very ecologically and economically important species in these regions in the western U.S. as well as in the lake states in some areas. And the interesting thing about trembling aspen is that it's a clonal species, and so it sprouts readily from root suckers, and that under some types of disturbance regimes and environmental conditions, the distribution of these clones and these stems from the same genetic stock can expand rapidly, and they can spread at high densities over large areas, and that may alter ecosystem structure and function. And as you can see here in this slide, they can form really dense stands and really affect what happens there in terms of, as that stand matures and develops over time, the ecosystem structure and function, even though it is a native species, could really impede your restoration efforts. And then over time, these stands will tend to fall apart, like the picture that you see here, once they gain maturity, and then they can actually change the productivity and the carbon dynamics in these soils. So they can have, even though it is a native species, it can be an invasive or a pest species when we think about it situationally or operationally within the context of a restoration plan. So there are some characteristics of invasive species here that we need to think about, and there are three factors that really contribute to the success of an invasive or pest species at a site that you may be trying to restore. The first is its ability to disperse to a site. So is it readily able to move into that site that you're trying to restore? Those that do, and those that have the ability to rapidly and to extensively disperse into a site may be ones that are of more primary concern. Another characteristic or factor that contributes to the success of an invasive species is really its adaptability to the physical environment of the new site. Is it a generalist? Can it survive in a variety of conditions, from really wet to really dry, for example, or from high pH to low pH? So the ability of that species to adapt to that physical environment can be a real important factor that will make you think that you need to address this as a species of concern in your restoration plan. And then a third factor that contributes to the success of an invasive or pest species is really the interaction with the species already present at the site. Right? Under certain conditions, will it actively outcompete other species in a way that is detrimental to the native species that you may be trying to promote? Oftentimes, the good example of this are cool season grasses that dominate much of the Midwestern U.S. that were once tall grass prairies. And when we go to restore tall grass prairies, we often find that when we plant our warm season grasses like big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, that those species actually cannot outcompete these non-native cool season grasses like fescues. And because of those competitive interactions, we often would be looking at changing the physical environment of the site to make it less productive. And one way to do that, especially if we're trying to restore prairie grasslands on a former agricultural site where we know that we have high nitrogen loading, is that we can add sawdust and we can change the nitrogen cycle to a point that makes that site less favorable with those native species, and it makes it less favorable for the non-native species and provides a competitive advantage and changes that interaction with our target species as compared to that non-native and invasive species. So these three factors, its ability to disperse to a site, its adaptability to the physical environment, and the interactions with species already present at the site are really going to drive how successful an invasive or pest species is going to be at a site that you're planning to restore. And so there are going to be many factors that contribute to this, and it's really going to be hard for you in any given situation to really identify all of the contributing factors, and it's going to be very, very difficult to tease apart cause and effect in terms of what factors are really driving or what causes are really driving the effect of an increase in invasive species. But even though it's going to be very difficult for you to define all of those contributing factors, there are three types of human impacts that seem to be especially influential in creating pest species and in creating these invasive species. And these three human factors are human transport, global climate change, and land use practices. And so we can look at each one of these here and think about that a little bit. So in terms of human transport, the movement of plants and animals across continents, really in the global marketplace, has resulted in the introduction of species to areas that really these species never have previously inhabited. And the rate of introductions has increased dramatically over the last 100 years as we've increased air travel and the movement of populations, human populations across the globe. And so this mixing of species is only going to continue to accelerate, especially with expanding global trade. And so when we think about this, it's really going to be those isolated ecosystems that are going to be particularly vulnerable to these introduced species behaving as pests. Right? So we think about the Hawaiian Islands, for example, that there are lots of introductions as humans transport to and from the islands, and these species that are there that are native to those island environments have developed in the absence of some of these other species, and then when we introduce them, they often cause more problems because those species that have evolved in the absence of these interactions really aren't capable of resisting those ecosystem changes. In terms of global climate change, these are really going to affect where individual species are inhabiting and how and with what other species they're interacting. And so as CO2 levels rise and temperatures change as a result, that's going to result in potentially new combinations of groups of species that are going to be interacting that haven't interacted before, or at least haven't interacted for long periods of time in terms of the geologic timescale. And so we can think of a lot of different ways that global climate change is really going to impact how we deal with invasive species. So, as introduced species react in a variety of ways to a range of factors, they're really going to create these new community assemblages. And so oftentimes what you'll find too is that elevated CO2 levels in the atmosphere are known to increase growth rate in size and biomass of some plant species and lead to changes in their chemical composition. And so that might make those species much more invasive and harder to manage, right? And contribute to alterations in natural disturbance events such as fire. And there's a species of bromus, an exotic species in the western United States that's impacting grasslands known as cheatgrass, that basically is less nutritious than native grasses, has limited wildlife habitat value, right, but has become a dominant grass because it has dramatically changed the flammability of these ecosystems as it's become established, and disrupted and increased that fire frequency, right? And so we've changed the fire return interval to a point that it then favors cheatgrass over native grasses that aren't as adapted to that frequent fire regime in areas of Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. So there are a lot of ways that global climate change can really impact not only the disturbances but also the mix of species. And then finally, it's not just these human activities that move species around the globe and changes to the global systems, but human activities also transform the local landscape and are responsible for disturbances that create new environments that are then going to be colonized by invasive species. And so as we develop environments that are heavily dissected and have lots of edges in terms of road boundaries and field boundaries, if say we're in an agricultural landscape, or we might be putting skid trails through intact forests that are used to extract timber or other resources, those introduce and change the environment and introduce an area that certain plants and species can exploit and move in and take advantage and gain a foothold in some of these areas. And so this land use change can really, in land use practices, can really help foster the spread of invasive species by providing new habitats and moving in and changing the environment in a way that then favors these invasive species over our native non-invasive ones. And so if we look at some of the impacts of invasive species and think about why restoration ecologists should be concerned about these species, there's a variety of points that I think we can make. The first is that increases in invasive species often come at the expense of native species, and as a result, these invasive species now become a major concern of any restoration plan. All right, so if you go back to the SER International Primer, we're trying to restore ecosystems that are dominated predominantly by native species, those that are going to enhance the structure and function of those ecosystems that reflect some restored site. And so when we have invasive species introductions into these areas, we often find that they're going to increase in dominance and abundance at the expense of the native species that we're really trying to focus in on in terms of restoring their numbers or restoring the structure and function of that those native species actually provide. Another thing that we need to be thinking about and why you should be concerned about invasive species is because your restoration activities are often going to basically disturb a site. So think about what you might be doing if you're trying to return agricultural land or abandon land that was once prairie but now has shrubs and woods and wooded trees dominating on those sites. Those areas you're going to have to disturb heavily to restore back to a grassland. So you're going to disturb the site, you may disturb it considerably, and as a result you're going to create an introduction vector for invasive species. Okay, and so this doesn't matter whether you're dealing with grassland or forest land restoration. This could be a significant issue that you face, and you're thinking about changing the dynamics of the environment to foster those species that you're targeting for your restoration, but at the same time you're providing an opportunity for these invasive species or pest species to take advantage of that situation. And then finally, another reason why you really need to be focused on invasive species is because they can have numerous effects on ecosystem structure and function, in many times in ways that you might not even imagine, which is another reason why you need to be up to speed on the best available science as a restoration professional on invasive species so that you do understand these interactions. And the paper that we had you read this week on honeysuckle restoration from forests here in Ohio really demonstrates that these species can have dramatic impacts on ecosystem structure and function, and as a result you need to be focused on those aspects and those changes. And so let's just look at a few of those and some of those effects that have happened in terms of some of the ecosystem changes and impacts on ecosystem functions and processes that invasive species have had. So one classic example that's impacted a lot of the forest here in the eastern United States, especially in the Appalachian region, is chestnut blight. So Kyphonectria parasitica, which is a fungus that was introduced from China in the early 1900s, has basically decimated our native communities of American chestnut, Castanea dentata. And as a result has altered the forests of where American chestnut once dominated. And a lot of these we don't really understand what some of those long-term effects have been. But prior to the blight, as you can see here on the left, this is a picture taken from the Forest Service. These were numerous large trees. They were considered a foundation species in these Appalachian forests in the eastern U.S. They were numerous. They were nut-producing trees. great wildlife mass producer, and now they're functionally extinct in these forests, and the forests have been recovering, and as a response to the loss of American chestnut. And so you can see the impacts of the blight here, the fungus. You can still find American chestnut saplings and seedlings out in the woods if you walk around the mountains in the Appalachians, but once they get to a certain size, which is sometimes no greater than 1 inch in diameter at the root collar, they become infected through some kind of damage by the fungus, and it effectively girdles the tree and kills it. And so we know this has changed light dynamics. It's probably changed the fire frequency and fire intensity in these systems, and as a result, it's an issue that we might have in terms of an invasive pathogen being introduced into our forests, and as a result, its result has had a major impact on ecosystem structure and function. Another example that we could look at that's common here in the eastern U.S. is the introduction of reed canary grass. So a lot of times this introduced species dominates wet prairies in the Midwest. It does very well with these kind of wetter sites, and basically chokes out any native species and results in this monoculture of reed canary grass. And its impact on ecosystem structure and function is really interesting. In fact, there have been studies that have shown that above productivity is higher than where reed canary grass does not dominate, but below ground it's much lower. And there's evidence to suggest that this might be a permanent change even after some sort of restoration plan to eradicate reed canary grass is in place. And so ultimately what we've done is we've changed that dynamic below ground, and as a result we're going to have issues when we try to restore our native species. And then finally, we mentioned this on our walk through the Olentangy River Wetland Park, where we were looking at the bottomland forest along the Olentangy River during this section, and mentioned that there's another species that's invasive, which is the Eurasian tamarisk, or also known as salt cedar, that's having a really dramatic impact on riparian areas in the southwestern United States. And so this tamarisk, which is native to Eurasia, absorbs vast quantities of groundwater, right? And we're dealing with, in the southwestern United States, an arid environment to start with. And so this species was introduced for erosion control as part of trying to deal with the loss of topsoil and soil, both from wind as well as from runoff in these semi-arid environments, right? And then it spread into the wetlands and nutrient-poor uplands, and then along riparian areas. And so it can transpire up to 300 gallons of water per day. So it's taking water, which is a scarce resource in these arid environments, pulling it out of the soil in the below ground and transpiring it back into the atmosphere. And so that severely limits the availability of water for other plants, especially those native plants that may have adaptations to this semi-arid environment, but when we draw down that water level even more, is going to have a pretty dramatic impact on the ability of these native plants either to persist in these environments, or if we're thinking about restoring them back, if we don't handle and get the species under control. Another issue that's really a problem here with salt cedar is, as the name implies, there are soil salinity can really build up as salt secretions are emitted from its leaves. And so as the leaves fall down to the soil surface, we have the ability to increase the salt levels in the soil. And so once we increase those cations, we're going to change the chemical composition of the soil, which then may influence soil fertility measures. And so over time, this is going to create an environment where it's highly competitive at the expense of other native species, and then we end up with this kind of monoculture of an invasive species that is going to be highly persistent and take a lot of effort to remove from this landscape. Another thing that we need to be concerned about when we think about invasive species and pests are the impacts that it has on wildlife habitat. So the habitat loss and fragmentation and ecosystem degradation that are typically associated when we lose native species and see a corresponding increase in invasive species is going to negatively impact wildlife habitat. And so I think we can see this with, the earlier work that we read of Joy Zedler, where we have seen that, wildlife are going to be impacted by the structure of those communities and in the structure of the plants, which is going to be tied back to that environment that we're trying to restore. And so when we lose these native species and the structure or function that they provide, not only in terms of productivity and nutrient cycles, but also in the habitat that it provides for different wildlife species, that can be something that we're going to need to be thinking about as well in terms of restoration projects. So how do we really deal with these invasive species? So I think the first thing that you need to do is you need to understand what specific traits help make a species invasive and the factors that exacerbate the impacts of the invasive species at the site you're trying to restore. And the lecture that Matt's going to provide this week is really covering these two factors on what makes a species invasive and the factors in the ecosystem or the environment that make it more invasive in terms of not being able to tolerate or prevent the invasion of these non-native or pest species. I think the second thing, and where I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture, is on the need to understand some basic management principles and strategies that you can use to help deal with invasive species. And keep in mind, these are going to be general management principles and strategies that you're going to need to tailor to the specific traits and characteristics of the invasive or pest species that you're dealing with. And so I think what you really need to do first is focus on these interrelated challenges of eradicating, containing, and controlling the invasive species. And that's really going to dictate how you approach your invasive species management plans as part of your restoration project. And I will say that early detection and prevention is really the gold standard for invasive species management. The sooner you find it, and the sooner that you implement measures to prevent future invasions, the better you'll be in terms of controlling and managing invasive species in the habitats or the sites that you're trying to restore. And so as a general approach to how we might go about dealing with invasive species, the first thing you want to do is really focus on establishing your restoration goals for the site that you're trying to restore, right? So this goes back to our lecture on how you develop a restoration plan, and you're going to establish these goals for your site. And once you've done that, you're going to go out and you're going to do an inventory and analysis of the current site. And any type of inventory and analysis really should include a component where you're looking to identify invasive or pest species, and then think about how they're going to interfere with your restoration goals, and then assign priorities for control. So which of those species are going to be really going to interfere with your restoration goals, and then you're going to prioritize which ones you need to deal with first, which ones you may need to just eradicate, or which ones may not be a big problem at all in terms of how you move forward with your restoration plan. Third, you're going to want to determine what aspects of the site in terms of, say, ecosystem structure, function, ecosystem processes may be facilitating these invasive or pest species problems. And then you need to develop plans for correcting these underlying site problems. So another example might be, how do you deal with non-native species in a tallgrass prairie restoration where you're trying to eradicate or remove those non-native cool season grasses, but you want to favor your warm season tallgrass prairie species, both grasses and forbs. And you know that if you have a really productive site, and that underlying problem is going to be that inherent nitrogen levels that are associated with active and long-term fertilization, because it's been ag land that now you're trying to restore back to a prairie ecosystem, you may need to deal with that underlying and develop a plan to deal with that underlying problem or issue with the site that may facilitate that dominance of those cool season grasses. And here we know from considerable research in this example that that's really manipulating the nitrogen cycle. And if we can manipulate the carbon to nitrogen ratios, we can bound up a lot of that nitrogen below ground by adding carbon in the form of, say, wood chips or sawdust to our soil before we plant our warm season grasses and forbs. And as a result, we can tie up a lot of that excess nitrogen and sort of starve those cool season grasses of their ability to outcompete our target warm season grasses. So in this way, we need to, again, focus on the site that may be facilitating that non-native invasive species community. Once we've done that and we've taken effective measures, developed a plan, we then need to identify effective control measures, right? And that may be, physically removing invasive species like we did with autumn olive at the wilds on our field trip, or other kind of control measures using glyphosate or other herbicides, or other types of management techniques, silvicultural techniques if we're in a forest system, that may help reduce non-native and invasive species. So once we've identified those control options, we can then develop the plan, implement the plan, and then monitor and assess the impact of our management actives. And then, like all restoration plans, as we've talked about before, once we've done our monitoring and we have some idea of how effective we've been, we can evaluate how successful our eradication and control methods are, and use adaptive management principles to refine control priorities, methods, and goals over time. All right, so this is a good general approach that you can use as you move forward, thinking about how you would design a invasive species plan as part of your restoration project. So some general things about controlling invasive species here, or pest species. A lot of how you decide, or what you decide, which management strategies to initiate as part of your restoration plan. You're going to need to first identify which species to manage immediately and which ones to manage later, if at all. And one way to really guide your decision making about potentially undesirable species and the most appropriate management strategy to implement as part of your restoration plan is to ask some questions related to goals of your restoration plan, thinking about that ecosystem developmental trajectory that we talked about earlier in the semester. All right, and so you always use that kind of your goal, and then look to see how these undesirable species may be impacting the development of that ecosystem structure and function, which is where we're focused on in terms of our restoration plan and our restoration activities. Okay, and so there will be some questions that you can ask about this. You can ask, how and what extent do the species alter community composition, structure, or function across space and over time? And does the species replace or diminish key species or life forms that play a pivotal or essential roles in the survival or development of the community? All right, and then, is the pest species infestation likely due to some underlying site condition? And do I need to correct that before the pest species can actually be managed? And so how we manage those through these control species, oftentimes we can look at the life history characteristics of that species itself and gain some insight in how best to control. And there's a variety of different examples here, but I just want to share a few with you that might be some rules of thumb when you think about controlling invasive species. And so if we have species with high population growth rates, and you know that they're going to explode once they get a foothold in these communities that you're trying to restore or that you've restored and you're trying to maintain, it's best to really keep a key on what's out there, have a good monitoring program, and then when you find them, initiate control efforts to eradicate these populations of non-native and invasive species when they're small and when they're new. Right? So again, that gold standard is hit it hard, hit it early. Right? If you have plant species with well-developed mechanisms for pollination and seed dispersal, right? If you have species that have lots of light seed, tamarask is an example like this, where it's growing along riparian corridors where it may be picked up and moved in the stream or the river itself. Focusing control efforts that prevent flowering and seed maturation, or making sure that you do that before the seeds mature, can be really important. And also thinking about how you deal with destroying the material that you've eradicated. Are you going to burn it? Are you going to pick it up and move it off site? Those sorts of things are going to be pretty important when you think about how to eradicate or control the population of the invasive species, especially if it has well-developed mechanisms for seed dispersal and pollination. Another example that we could look at, or a control strategy that's kind of based on these life history characteristics, is that for some plant species that are going to grow really rapidly under certain conditions, you may need to modify the environment, right? And so, you may have areas that you are opening the canopy to help foster oak regeneration, based on what we learned last week when we were looking at fire and how that impacts oak hickory ecosystems. Well, once we open those canopies up, we may be changing conditions on the forest floor that foster the germination and spread of, say, garlic mustard or honeysuckle or other invasive species that may be present in those forests. And so we may need some way to modify that environment at the same time we're trying to deal with our restoration plan. And then where we have few species, or for species where we have few natural controls, we probably would want to explore physical or biological controls. And this is something that there's going to be usually where you can rely on research from university scientists or federal agency scientists that are specifically looking at biological controls to help limit the spread and impact of certain pests. You can go to APHIS, for example, to look to see are there specific strategies for controlling or regulating or minimizing the effect of, say, hemlock woolly adelgid, an introduced insect pest that's decimating our hemlock forests across the eastern U.S. Right, and so they are actually looking at biological controls, other insects that they can release that then feed on the adelgid, just as an example. Emerald ash borer is another insect pest, an invasive species that's affecting eastern forests really dramatically, that we're exploring biological controls for. In some of these areas, there may be chemical controls that can help you maintain some kind of low level of protected plants, for example. And some of the metro parks in the Dayton area are actually doing some of this with some of the ash, mature ash species, trying to keep them alive strategically, so that perhaps 5, 10, 20 years out, if we find a control for emerald ash borer, there is a genetic and individuals on site that can be used to repopulate the ash community in those forests. So just some final thoughts regarding invasive species here. I think really your priorities for invasive species or pest species management really should reflect the on-site problems and issues of the pest itself. So you really do need to understand the characteristics, the biology, and the life history characteristics of the plant or animal species that is a pest. You need to really focus on the likely severity of present or future harmful impacts that pest may pose to your restored ecosystem. You need to think about the value of the habitats that these invasive and pest species are going to impact. Is it a remnant ecosystem that you're trying to restore and maintain? And if an invasive species gets in there, is it going to really dramatically change it? Are there habitats there that, your restoration plan is just not going to be successful to foster that community of plants and animals that you really want to restore, if that species, non-native and invasive species, is present? If it is, you really need to think that that's maybe a really valuable habitat and it's going to have a high impact. So you need to be thinking about that. And then finally, you really need to be thinking about the feasibility of control. All right. When we think about the cost associated with trying to control hemlock woolly adelgid or emerald ash borer as an invasive pest, we really can't do that cost efficiently. So you may need to be thinking about the feasibility of control, how you're going to deal with that, and then how you're going to think about restoring your site once those pests are present. On the flip side, you may be dealing with something like with honeysuckle, that if you can control it and continually maintain it with volunteers going in and pulling them out, that may be something that you can really do and do well and control and regulate, and as a result really have a positive and beneficial effect of invasive species control in that ecosystem. And so what I would suggest is that you use a priority setting approach and risk analysis approach to help determine how best to tackle your invasive species problems when you're designing your restoration plan. So think about what risks what are the risks and what are the benefits of trying to control and eradicate each invasive species pest, and then create some priorities, because you are going to be dealing with limited resources. And you can almost guarantee that there's going to be some sort of invasive or pest species that's going to be a problem as part of your restoration project. And so trying to prioritize which ones to focus on by understanding the life history characteristics of the species, how it interacts with its environment, and then how that's going to impact your restoration goals is really going to be key to how you move forward. So finally, I'm just going to play a short video of some restoration work with invasive species that the National Park Service has been doing in the Great Lakes region associated with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative.
It's so important for everyone to know about invasive species because it affects everyone. We want to be able to take our kids to national parks and see beautiful landscapes and not a sea of sweet clover and bittersweet and cattail. I'm Laura Thompson, biotech at Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, and I love to remove invasive species from natural habitats. This is yellow sweet clover, really pretty yellow plant, but it's a non-native invasive species, and we want to pull it out of nice habitats like this to get rid of it before it gets rid of all the native species in this area. With the park having so many edges with railroads and roads, we have a lot of areas that are really easily infested because they're disturbed areas.
Well, Oriental bittersweet in particular is very bad because it can take trees that are century old and grow up to the top of them.
You can see the kind of harm these plants do to the tree, and it just girdles it, and that's one way they'll kill the tree is girdling it.
It's a garden plant, and in gardens they look nice. But out here, it can literally pull trees down, and if unchecked, 50 years from now, we're not going to have any tall trees. They're all going to be on the ground, covered with bittersweet. I know it takes me an hour to clear out one tree when it's heavily infested. But then I've saved that tree for another 10, 15, 20 years.
I am so passionately in love with this area. I've seen what invasives do to these great native habitats. I want to make every part of my day to prevent these areas from disappearing.
My name's Steve Yancho. I'm Chief of Natural Resources at Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. It's interesting that USGS has described us as the poster child of invasive species. These are some real nasty players right here. This is spotted knapweed. It's one of those plants that tends to exclude other plants once it comes in, and so the biodiversity is missing. It's no longer there. And when everything's in balance, everything tends to work. When things come into this system, such as a non-native plant, they're in here without the checks and balances that the native vegetation has, and so they just go hog wild. This plant right here is pitcher's thistle. We have to try and maintain this habitat since this is one of the last real strongholds for this plant in this dune system here. This plant really relies on the fact that the sands move. So if the sands don't move, these seed heads don't get buried very easily. When you have things like baby's breath, spotted knapweed, or a lot of vegetation that normally isn't here, they tend to lock the sand down. The sand doesn't move. The pitcher's thistle plant is going to be a loser. It's going to eventually drop out of the system. A lot of the dune plants are very fragile. Here's some beach pea right in front of us here. It's a plant that's become accustomed to this open beach environment.
This is black locust. It's a species of tree that is not native to our area of the country. It's a highly invasive plant that actually has a negative impact on the native plants.
Every time the trailer goes off, they'll be bloated. We just did that. I mean, we can't do a lot, but we could do a little. I guess that equals a lot in the end.
We hate invasive plants! people don't intend to move invasive plants from place to place. They just happen to be stuck in their bootlaces or in the treads of their boots while they're walking along. And so the biggest way to stop the spread of invasive species would be cleaning your boots, cleaning your gear. Anytime you're leaving an area that may be infested, or before you enter a new natural area.
One person can make a difference. One step at a time, you can change the world.